Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are delighted to have Dacre Stoker, great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, here to talk to you today. I'm so excited about his slideshow and hearing him talk about all of this history and legend related to Dracula. At the end of this period, when the bell rings, if you need to go, you will go. Okay, and if you don't need to go, you'll sit tight, and as soon as the people have left, he'll keep talking, and also maybe have some time for some questions. Okay? So, I think that's it. Without further ado, Mr. Dacre Stoker.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you for setting this up. I first met some of your staff at Fox Hills bookstore when I was doing a signing there, and the interesting thing that I heard is you folks were putting on a production based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, my great-granduncle. Certainly, I was overwhelmed when I started this project in 2003 to write a book and sort of have the courage to stand up to the scrutiny of the world press when they say, well, who the heck is this guy who's got the guts to say, you know, he's a relative and he's writing a family-endorsed sequel. And I look back at that a little bit naively now and think, was I really ready for, you know, the onslaught of the press and a critical review, which is something I really wasn't used to. I've been a teacher, and I've been an athlete, and I've been a coach. You'll hear a little bit more about that at the beginning, but the message is I love to bring to school students is that you know, have the courage to face some of these things. You don't have to be a relative of a famous person to step out and do something. Being on stage like some of you have done, writing a piece of creative work, drawing something, putting yourself on the line in a sporting contest, you know, it can be pretty demanding and pretty stressful, but you tend to learn a little bit about yourself when you do something like that. And I certainly have. I've learned a lot about my family as well, and I'm going to share some of that with you this afternoon. And but the family is an interesting one. Obviously, Bram Stoker is one of the most famous members of the family, but also the guy I was named after was. He was the first Dacre Stoker, commander of the first submarine that the Australians owned in World War I. And if anybody's ever heard of the Battle of Gallipoli, anybody heard of Gallipoli? There was a movie with Gibson in it, but it was actually a horribly tragic event for the Australian, New Zealand, and British forces as they were trying to land in Turkey. And my namesake, my godfather, was able to sail a submarine up this very narrow stretch of land called the Dardanelles against all odds. It was a suicide mission. And they were captured at the end of it, but what they did was they wreaked havoc in the Sea of Marmara and scared the Turks. Never in history has an enemy breached the Dardanelles. So Dacre Stoker did some pretty amazing things as well. He got captured, they scuttled the sub so the enemy didn't get it, and he then ended up escaping from the Turkish prison during World War I. And he was a distant relative as well as a friend. Just a little bit about myself. I won't spend too much time with it, but one of the interesting things I did that gave me some insight into culture in the Eastern countries is I traveled around the world for about 12 years competing and then coaching in a sport called modern pentathlon, which is running, shooting, swimming, fencing, and riding. I made the 1980 Olympic team for Canada, but that was a year of a boycott. Western countries boycotted the 1980 Olympics because the Russians had invaded Afghanistan, and none of us got to go play in Moscow that year. So I set my sights back on a teaching career and became a coach because I just couldn't do two things at once. It was just too much to compete at that level and accumulate enough points to make a team. I'm a CPR and first aid instructor. That's the bloodlust side of me coming out a little bit. And it is rather interesting when people know who I am when I go forward and do the head tilt chin lift and put the breath in the person think I'm exposing the soft neck of the man. I also love to fly fish, and I'll show you later that so does Bram Stoker love to fly fish, and that's my kind of reflective time. And I actually get some pretty creative thoughts when I'm out of the stress of life and just relax on a fishing river. I want to show you the family tree and show you where I actually fit in. This is Bram. He was one of 7 children. His mother and father. Father was a civil servant in Dublin Castle, which means he was, basically running the municipal government in Dublin at the time. Not the head guy, but he was somewhere in the middle. And his mother was a very outspoken, strong advocate of women's rights. In those days, women didn't have any rights in Ireland. And Charlotte Thornley Stoker was a strong advocate of that. And a lot of people think, and I will be telling you a little bit about theories that I've picked up about Bram and my family's background and how they got integrated into his most famous novel, Dracula, as well as some of the things I used to put into my novel, in my co-authored novel, Ian Holt. A lot of people think that maybe Charlotte Thornley was a model for Mina Harker. Mina Harker, for those of you that have read Dracula or watched the play, was a very strong-willed woman. And there was sort of a joke in the world of scholars that what did it take to beat the supernatural power or overcome the supernatural power? A lot of modern technology and one strong-willed woman. And we think that strong-willed woman of Mina was fashioned after Charlotte. You're going to hear a little bit about this guy in a moment, Sir William Thornley. He got knighted later in his life. He got knighted at the same time Sir Henry Irving was knighted. Bram Stoker ended up working for Sir Henry Irving for 27 years, managing his theater. So his brother and his boss got knighted at the same time for significant accomplishments. Matilda and Margaret, these 2 sisters of Bram's, we don't know too much about them. We know they got married. We don't know if they had any children. There's not too many records. Sadly, in those days, another sort of sad thing about women is even in our family, records were not kept too much about women. Of course, on the men's side, we have lots of records. Here's Bram. He was married to Florence Malcolm. They only had 1 child, Noel. Noel was married and had Anne Stoker, who then ended up getting married to Dobbs and then Macabre because Dobbs died. So the Stoker name with the most direct descendants has died out. These are the great-grandsons, Noel, James, and Robin. And they're the guys that I went to and said, do you mind if I write a sequel and you will give me your family blessing? Because the publishers really wanted to say, this is a family-endorsed sequel or an official sequel. And it sounded good, and they said, well, Dacre, you've never steered us wrong so far. And I know these guys a little bit, but we don't expect you to show us a manuscript, but at least give us an outline of the novel, so you're not, some really gross slasher book that wouldn't depict Bram very well or a sequel. So when I told them I was going to put Bram in the story and how I was going to depict Bram, they actually helped me characterize Bram a little bit, and that helped open my eyes up to my relative. But that was very important, and to this day, they are helping me as we're actually trying to reclaim some of the rights of Bram Stoker, because there was not even an official estate. And we've since then had to hire attorneys so that we can say, anybody wants to say this is like for instance, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, great movie. They didn't have to ask permission from the family, they didn't have to pay the family a penny, because it was not established as an estate. A comic book has just come out about Bram Stoker in the Demeter ship that came over from Varna with Dracula. They can call it Bram Stoker. And so this is the first official copyright challenge that we're able to make to protect that guy's name, protect the content of it as well. George Stoker's my great-grandfather, the youngest brother of Bram. And of course, he had a son, Tom Thornley, who got married. He came to Canada. He came to Eastern Canada, Montreal, and that's where my family was. Here's my dad. This brother of my father's died in World War II. He was a navigator in a bomber that went down, and then Patrick is still alive. So these 3, myself and my sisters, are alive, and these 2 are, and these guys. And that's really about it for Bram Stoker's most direct descendants. So what was it like following up with this literary pop culture icon? I was a little bit intimidated about where I was going to go with this thing. But so many people have done so many different things with Dracula that I felt, and so did Ian Holt, that we need to come back to the type of Dracula novel that Bram would write if it was modernized just a little bit more, rather than, some of these spin-offs are fantastic, but it's not the same way Bram would have depicted them. I want to point out to you a couple things. If any of you have read Dracula or watched any movie that involves Dracula, raise your hand. Leave your hand up if you remember the character Van Helsing. How many people? Okay. Van Helsing, you put your hand down now. We know, you'll see shortly, that this brother, Sir William Thornley, was very helpful in writing Dracula, but we also know that he was, we don't know for sure, there's nothing for sure unless Bram writes it. We speculate with great confidence that this is the brother, this is the person he fashioned Van Helsing after. Why is that? Well, I'm not going to read you everything in the PowerPoint. You folks are paper wet, and I think that's a boring way to do a PowerPoint. But you can read while I chat. But he did a lot of interesting surgeries, well before their time. He was the head of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, very well respected. But he also had very interesting connections to work on the insane. His wife in real life went insane. He did operations on the insane, trying to fix their brain problems, to maybe fix their behavior. So there's a lot of tie-ins between Sir William Thornley and dealing with Renfield, and also, as you'll see here, surgery. These are the first page of the notes that I had access to. 125 pages of notes are sitting in a museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this is one page that Sir William Thornley actually wrote and gave to his brother. And this describes, for those of you that, again, saw one of the movies or the book, the actual scene in the insane asylum where Dracula sneaks into the cell where Renfield is, because he can turn into mist and beat the living daylights out of Renfield, because Renfield's spilling the beans on where he is and what Dracula's intentions are, coming to England to find more hunting ground. And Renfield suffers a brain hemorrhage, and Seward and Van Helsing have to perform emergency surgery. And so what do? They make these incisions. And recently I was on a fishing trip in southern Argentina, and the weather was terrible, and I had my laptop with me, and after a day of telling fishing stories, we had to look for other things to do. So I pulled up the laptop, and there was two neurosurgeons from Seattle there. And I said, hey guys, does this mean anything to you? This was 1885 that this was actually drawn up. And we enlarged it, analyzed it with a little magnifying glass, and he goes, holy smokes. Your relative knew an awful lot about brain surgery back in those days. I didn't think these things were invented until many, many years later. So Sir William Thornley is telling him, make the incision here, this is what will happen to the body. And here's a hospital he worked in Ireland. The other brother, my great-grandfather, that had a direct influence on the writing of Dracula, was because he had an interesting career in the military, but it was in the hospital force. The Irish would lend their hospital people, their doctors, to these different battles. In this one, he was with the Turkish army against the Bulgarians and the Russians in 1877. And during this time, he sent letters back to his brother Bram explaining what it looked like over there. Because Bram Stoker never went to Transylvania. He never got closer than Italy. So how did he get such great descriptions of these mountains, these Carpathian mountains at the Borgo Pass? It's because George wrote him letters and wrote to him, this is what it looks like. Very, very similar between the letters and the descriptions of Dracula. Let's talk about Bram for a moment. There's some interesting mysteries about Bram that a lot of people don't know that sort of lead to how did this guy, who himself was raised in a very conservative family, his father was a civil servant, his brothers were doctors, one of the brothers was in the military, fairly high up. And how did this guy ever sort of break out of this life that he was having, this kind of very, almost dull life, and have the courage to start writing? And also, this whatever dark side of him came out to write such an interesting and dark novel. And we're going to focus on that for the next couple of moments. He was born just outside of Dublin in 1847, but he was unable to walk for the first 7 years of his life. He was stricken by some strange illness. To this day, nobody knows what it was. Speculation about polio or rheumatic fever. The problem with that is that he then accelerated his growth at the age of 8 and became a champion athlete when he was a teenager and then a young man at Trinity College in Dublin. So polio would have left his body stricken, and same with rheumatic fever, lung problems and so on. So it's again, a big, big mystery, but what we do know, being bedridden, that his mother had to entertain him. Remember, a family of 7. She told him a lot of stories about the cholera epidemic when she was growing up. And these stories centered around this horrible infectious disease that nobody knew how to deal with. And part of the offshoot of that was these towns, in rural towns in Ireland, were having to barricade themselves so ill people wouldn't come into the town to bring the disease. Nobody knew how it was transmitted, by touch, by saliva, airborne. So this was paranoid times. And if anybody would start coughing and sputtering, nobody wanted to take any chances with them. They weren't going to the clinic to get a shot. They were being shoved into a grave, even if they weren't quite dead yet. So imagine how Bram would get this sort of vision in his mind from his mother saying everyone was paranoid, people were being thrown in graves, and people dragging themselves out of graves before they were actually dead. So this was something we really believe had a lot to do with framing this young child's mind, almost traumatizing him to think of people dragging themselves out of a grave. He then went on to Trinity College, and he did very, very well in school. He became the head of the president of the Philosophical and Historical Society, which really doesn't mean much probably to anybody in America in these days, but it was a big deal. It's like the Honor Society, but you actually sit down a couple of times a week and you debate positions, you write papers, the papers are presented, and if you're a member of one of these things in good standing, it's writing your ticket for a good job anywhere afterwards. So he was president of both at one time, which was quite an achievement. He then got out of college and started working in his father's footsteps. And this is where, to me, it's really interesting. Because here's this guy who's this kind of boring, dull civil servant, and he's become a clerk of petty sessions. What are petty sessions? This is the very low-level court system. This is worrying about dog licenses and what happens if somebody runs over somebody else's chicken, or taxes. Very boring stuff. But Stoker saw this as a challenge, because it really bothered him that there was no organization, that every different court in every county was not unified. So he complained to his boss, and his boss said, well, Stoker, go do something about it. Go write a manual on it, or get rid of it. Well, he did. And an interesting thing happened when he did that, is that this manual became the book that the Irish court system used right up until 1960. He also got to travel around the country and pick up a lot of Irish folklore and history. And if you've ever studied Ireland, you'll know this is one of these countries that has a lot of interesting folklore about, of course, leprechauns is the one we all know about, but all kinds of other, horrible things and whimsical things. Very interesting folklore. And he got a lot of that, and it shows up in some of his other novels as well. He married Florence Balcombe at the same time that he got this job offer by Sir Henry Irving to move to London and work for him. What's interesting about this is that Balcombe was dating Oscar Wilde at the time, because Oscar Wilde became very famous later on in his life. He was in prison for homosexuality. He traveled all over America and became very well known for poetry and very outspoken on other social issues. Bram ran off with his Balcombe off to London, where he then became a manager of Sir Henry Irving's theater. And if you can imagine, in those days, folks, they didn't have movies. They had theater. And the high society of the time focused on these plays, and the Lyceum Theater was the massive entertainment source in London, which was the center of the world at the time. And because of that, he had great contact with some very high-end people. Walt Whitman, he became friends with Winston Churchill, Prime Minister Gladstone. He brought the Lyceum Theater over to America 8 times, and in that time, he got to know Teddy Roosevelt and Mark Twain as well. So he definitely rubbed shoulders with some of the bigwigs and was very, very well received and well known because of that. Here's the Lyceum, here's his boss, who was George Clooney, Brad Pitt, all rolled into one. He was the big stud at the time. He was kind of a party guy and had a different relationship with his wife, and Bram organized all the finances, organized the scheduling, and took care of making sure Irving would get on the stage at time in a sober mind. What I find interesting is on the 5th and 6th tour to America, look where he comes, folks, all the way down this area, Atlanta, January 24th and 25th, 1895-96. He was writing Dracula between 1890 and 1897. So it took him 7 years to write the story, and during that time he's traveling with the Lyceum Theater troupe, and he was in your backyard. And maybe he got inspired by something for some of his notes. I saw all kinds of very cool notes on the back of papers, and one of them was actually a hotel up in Philadelphia which is about 2 blocks away from where the notes now reside. Quite interesting. Other books that he's written, this was the most popular one at the time, Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving. When Irving died in 1906, that basically shut down Bram Stoker's life as a theater manager. His best friend died, and he writes a story about it, and it's the bestseller of the time. Dracula was not a bestseller until after Bram died. As a matter of fact, I'm about to read you a couple of things about Dracula, and you'll wonder, why are they referring to Dracula this way? Because it was not a hit until the late 20s, when the stage production of Dracula made people shift their attention to this popular form of entertainment, and then where did the story come from? So they go back and read the book. So the tragic message here is that Bram Stoker died in 1912. He didn't know that this story that he wrote was a smidgen of the success it is today. I'm going to read to you his obituary, or a part of it, just to tell you a little bit about Bram, and then you'll also pick up a little bit on a writing style, which I think is quite interesting. Again, this is 1912. Stoker relieved Irving of every possible care. He was the active host at the famous supper parties, stood between Irving and the crowd of theatrical aspirants and would-be playwrights. He paid the bills and arranged all the details of transportation for the Lyceum Theater troupe for 27 years. He was never tired and never depressed. He remembered the faces of names of all he ever met, or if he did not, he had the skill to make others believe he did. Undoubtedly, much of Irving's success was due to Bram Stoker. For the rest, he wrote fluently and was eagerly interested in all the affairs of the world. Deep down in his nature, there was a touch of Celtic mysticism. It sought expression in literary form, but his stories, though they were rather queer, were not of a memorable quality. His Life of Irving book, however, is a noteworthy book. He had plenty of friends and enough enemies to indicate that his friendship was worth having. The embodiment of health and strength and geniality, it seemed he died too young. He was almost 64 years of age. Almost everyone who knew him will say that he should have lived to be 90 and kept a young heart in his old age. So there's some interesting pieces in here talking about Bram's character that really doesn't come out much, because all we know about is he's the guy that wrote Dracula, so he must have been warped, he must have been a little bit crazy to write that story. But this a bit kind of sheds some light on him as a person. I'm going to bring up a little bit later some of his own personal reasons for writing Dracula, which I find amazing. I could find only 2 of them. In all the research that I did in 6 years, and I went to a lot of scholarly people and said, can you tell me about why Bram was motivated to write this story? What did Bram have to say about it? He said, well, Dacre, you're going to have a hard time finding anything. I said, why is that? He said, well, it wasn't a bestseller, so the journalists didn't flock to Bram and say, tell us about your story. More people have flocked to me, and we only made it to 22 on the bestseller list, but Bram's story wasn't even one of those. It didn't make it to bestseller until, of course, well after his passing. These are a couple of the theories, though, that I did pick up. I've already talked about his mother's stories of the cholera epidemic possibly affecting his mind. Anybody know about the term bloodletting? This is where I'm not going to let you fall asleep on me. Raise your hand if anybody has the guts to tell me what bloodletting is. Anybody know what that is? Right here.
It's sort of like they tried to cure you by cutting you or bleeding you out, getting out some blood.
Yeah. It was undiagnosed. They didn't know what was causing it. It wasn't an obvious injury or wound that they could just fix. He's sick. The blood is the life, so we got to get rid of some of that blood, and the bad stuff comes up. They still do that to this day with leeches. Leeches is a great way to on a specific type of illness or swelling, put it on an area to get that bad blood out. In his case, they would cut him open somewhere. But for 7 years, they cut this kid open. And just imagine the trauma of, along comes this person, maybe it's a woman dressed in white like a nurse's uniform, and cut him open, allow some of the blood to come out. And if you've ever given blood here, you know you're a little bit weak after a pint comes out. And so this was going on and on and on. And we know that it probably didn't help him much because the body has to recover and it's in a weakened state to then build up the antibodies to fight off what's really killing him or hurting him. So it may have delayed. But just think about this for a moment. Think about the scene in Dracula's castle where the women in white are sucking Jonathan Harker's blood repeatedly. And he doesn't have enough strength to escape from the castle because he's getting bloodlet or sucked. That's another theory. The other two that kind of go together are Henry Irving the boss and Henry Irving the actor. He was a tough boss, long hours. Bram loved every moment of it though, didn't resent it. But he was up to the beefsteak room, the parties they referred to in Quebec, 3 o'clock every morning that there was a play production going on. He didn't get home much. His wife resented it. He didn't see his son much. So he had a bit of a rough family life, and the family was sort of then replaced by Irving the boss. Irving the actor, he played many sinister Shakespearean roles for many years. Mephistopheles, which is the devil, Richard III, Hamlet, all these sinister roles that had to influence Bram Stoker create this character Dracula. We do know also in one of the 4 biographies of Stoker that his son was quoted, Noel was quoted saying, yes, one day Dad woke up and he claimed he had a horrible nightmare brought on by eating his meal of dressed crab. And we've heard people who eat very rich food have a hard time sleeping, indigestion, maybe they're feeling they're being smothered or killed. Who knows, maybe there's something to that. There was a theory also that he had an advanced form of syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, because his family life was a little bit questionable and maybe he sought out prostitutes, and that syphilis advanced stage can bring brain disease. Well, the problem with that theory that scholars helped me understand was that his brain was so warped for that period of time when he was writing Dracula, 1890, 1897, and yet he still managed to manage the Lyceum Theater up until 1907. How could he have done that if his brain was so far gone from syphilis? So that's questionable as well, who knows? We also know that a forensic psychologist is now working on a theory that Bram was an abused child, and that's what warped his mind. And this is not an original thought, but someone said, David, don't worry about that. He was brought up in the Victorian era. Everyone was an abused child. So don't take it personally. So here's your first glimpse of the notes that Bram Stoker wrote to create the traits of vampires as we know them today. It's hard to read, so you got my notes on the left side. Again, I won't read it to you, but remember this, Bram did not invent vampires. Vampires were already invented in mythology and history all over the world. And I'll read off in a moment the list of countries that Bram researched and found references to vampires. What he did was he brought them all together. There was another 4 or 5 pages like this. And then he pulled the ones out that he wanted and attached them to Dracula, the alpha vampire of all time. But what I think is cool when I look at this, and a lot of journalists say, Dacre, what do you think about, the way Stephanie Meyer has made, her vampires, and Charlene Harris and True Blood, and Stephen King and Anne Rice, they all came from your great-granduncle. I said, yeah, they did. It all started there, but there was a couple guys before Stoker. There was John Polidori, who wrote a story called The Vampire that got turned into a famous play. And Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, another Irishman, that before Bram made a lesbian vampire called Carmilla. So even in print, Bram didn't start the whole thing. But what he did was he borrowed information, he researched, he's got obviously a creative mind, but he scared the heck out of people because many things in his story were based on real life things. And the real life stuff is like this real mythology. I don't take anything away from Mary Shelley, but she created an equally horrifying story in Frankenstein, but that was out of her imagination. There wasn't mythology and history in 20 countries around the world about a body being put together with different dead body parts and making them alive again. So Bram's was more believable. Plus, at the same time in Victorian culture, what was going on? London was paranoid with Eastern immigration. Much like, we've got issues with immigration in this country. And yet, this was just the beginning of sort of, they were the center of the world, and all these Eastern Europeans were moving into their world, and what's it going to be like in your neighborhood? So what's Bram do? He has this count coming from Eastern Europe in a ship, buying up 3 properties in London. For what reason? Well, we learn later in the story, hunting grounds for more blood. But at the time, nobody really knew what this guy was doing, but it was a real issue, that these aristocracy and others were really moving from Eastern Europe into London of residences. What Bram also did in his novel, which was interesting, is he sequenced all the different journals and diary entries and movements of people so they were correct and feasible. The carriage rides, the train rides, the ship, how long it would take for a letter to go from Van Helsing to Seward from point A to B. It was right. So if you read the story, you were checking, oh, could it actually have taken this long to get from Atlanta to Woodstock? No, that was you know, in those days you couldn't do that in under 12 hours. Well, he had his day timer, which is what he ran his life on, because he managed this theater with 300 people and all these different movements. He was one of these real anal, probably the first touch BlackBerry kind of guy. And so this was his day timer that he turned into the day timer to organize Dracula. He also based chapters 6, 7, and 8 off of the real events in a real little town on the Yorkshire coast of England, the little town of Whitby. And this is where he spent many of his summer holidays. The ship that he based Dracula coming in on, the Demeter, was based off the real Dmitri. And if you can look right down here, it was a Russian ship. This is a real page. I'm not sure if he stole it or what he did, but that's not his handwriting. His handwriting is much worse than this, but from the Coast Guard station that talks about how this ship actually went into this harbor right here and landed on this beach in a massive storm. And it's very eerie if you read this and then you read in the actual story how similar it is. So basing things off of real things in real places makes the story even scarier. And if you haven't read it already, or if you have, pay particular attention to chapters 6, 7, and 8, and you'll see they talk about these steps. I've got a better picture later that takes you up to the church, the graveyard, and an abbey up there, which was one of the castles that he fashioned Dracula's castle after in the story. Here's my favorite page, though. And this is, again, the second time, so you don't fall asleep on me. I need some interaction from you guys. Find out how many times the word Dracula appears on this page. When someone's ready to take a shot at it, raise your hand. Yeah, that's better, thank you. I'll give you a signal when I'm going to read again. How many times is Dracula? This is the first time that we actually see it, and there's all this speculation about where did Bram come up with Dracula? You know, how much did he know about the real Vlad Tepes, the guy in Transylvania? I'll get to that in a moment. Anybody want to? I see some hands part of the way up. Who's going to try it? All right, let's start with the page at the top. Right here is one of them, right? Count Dracula underlined with great conviction. We feel that's any writer. If you guys were writing a story, you list your characters like you did here, all his characters. And he got to here, the Count, and he had the word Count, and then he had a name which he crossed out and replaced it with Dracula. I'm not sure if you were, again, a psychologist figuring out who wrote this and when he would have, the order when he wrote these in the book. But I kind of think maybe he wrote it here and here as a test. I wonder how Dracula would feel. If you start at the top, where am I going to stick this Dracula guy? Well, he got to here and he crossed out Wampir. That's what it was, Wampir. Sounds a little bit like Polidori's vampire. And of course, he didn't invent them, so that name was out there in many different languages already. So it could have been Austrian or German derivation of vampire. But then he writes Dracula here, 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 and this is when we figure out he's really set and comfortable with the name Count Dracula. This is going to be his guy. So what did I do with the page besides figure out how many times Dracula's written there? I looked for characters that he did not use and be able to insert them into my story. And this was the big one that jumps in for me. He had a detective here, and then the name Cuthbert. And yet the book Dracula has no detective. As a matter of fact, they have no police. And I'm not sure if that you guys found that as astounding as I did. But there's no police in Dracula. The closest to the police is Van Helsing and Homewood and Quincy Morris, the Texan, acting as police trying to get rid of Dracula. So why would I be so astounded about that? Well, I started looking at how many people died in that story. So again, anybody dare to make a guess? How many people died by the hands of a vampire in the book Dracula? We know Lucy, right? That's the most obvious. But we're not sure if she really died because of that, because who ended up killing Lucy? Homewood, her husband. But she was pricked a couple times and sucked the blood, but she was given a transfusion by 3 guys, and there's speculation that maybe Van Helsing didn't know anything about blood typing, maybe that killed her. But then in actual fact, it was Homewood and the boys that actually had to drive the stake through her heart. So that may or may not have been a vampire death, but certainly was a death. On the ship coming over from Varna, some of the guys in the ship either are killed by Dracula, their blood is sucked, or they jumped overboard to get away from him. And we know the captain's hands were lashed onto the wheel, and they rolled in, the ship rolled in with this guy, they're dead, and yet no police were called. We know Lucy's mother died in the story. Unexplained, maybe she was overcome and had a heart attack, but no police investigation. And we also know that Arthur Homewood became Lord Godalming during the story. So that means his father must have died. We don't know why. And we know at the very end of the story, when the band of heroes are chasing Dracula, that Quincy Morris dies because one of the gypsies shot him. So there are significant deaths. And I find it very unusual that Bram wouldn't have had a police investigation. Who knows? So that gave me the conviction that I could put his character into my book and figure out how to give him a reason to hunt something down. We also put some of these other characters, Kate Reed, Winchelsea, in the story. Here's where Bram, we know for sure, saw the reference to Dracula for the first time. Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. This was a book, and he typed this page. I don't know if you've noticed already how bad his handwriting was. Thank goodness he actually typed this one, because I could read it. But this is an actual excerpt from this book called The Account of Principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia. And so he again took research from somebody else and found where Dracula was written and modeled his character after somebody called Dracula, who the Wallachians used for devil. It's not a bad start. He didn't know much about, or we don't think he knows much about, the guy that really impaled people from Transylvania. That came out much later. But that's where my co-author said, hey, now the world knows a lot about the real Dracula. I want to place a character who's a merge between your great-granduncle's Count Dracula and the real Prince Dracula, and merge them together and create a character that way. And that's what we did. That's how our character came to be the type of Dracula that we wanted. Here's our one of our press photos. Before I get back to writing the book, just a fun little interlude to show you some of the covers of our story from around the world. I will tell you that authors have absolutely no say in the cover art. They simply send it to you and say, what do you think, after it's already been published. But that's pretty cool. This one, if you can't see it very well, from Brazil is a bat. And we know that Brazil has real vampire bats, in the Amazon. I think this was cool. I've never seen my name written in Russian. But back to the sort of the way that 2 guys write a book, and what we pulled out of Dracula to become Dracula the Undead. Ian wrote a script for In Search of Dracula, which is a pretty cool book if you're into this whole thing. It was written by 2 professors that told the world about who the real Vlad Tepes was, and Ian's script never went anywhere, so he had this idea that I want to do something with it. And that's when he hunted me down and said, would you write a story with me? Would you go into the family stuff that nobody knows about? And I want my Dracula to be brought to life. That's how the whole thing started. Bram's widow was the only one that did anything Dracula since her husband's death, and that was helping Dean and Balderston get clearance and authorization to actually do a stage production. So she had a hand in giving them permission and turning her husband's book into a stage play. It was that stage play that got very, very famous, and later on down the road had Bela Lugosi become very famous as an actor on stage and on screen. And this is where I'll ask another skill testing question. Bela Lugosi came from what country? Anybody know?
Russia.
Nope. Italy, Russia, Hungary. Didn't speak English very well. As a matter of fact, he couldn't read English when he read for the part. And that's why at the beginning of his career, his English was all phonetic. And that's why you hear in the movies, welcome to my castle. He's having to read his lines and learn them phonetically. He also was the guy that's credited with the dinner jacket as a Dracula costume. The only explanation in Dracula about a vampire in clothing is Dracula, and he's all dressed in black. It doesn't say it's in formal attire with a white tie or a black tie, or a cape. So it's really interesting that these standards that we now see, the dinner jacket, the high collar, the big cape, is because stage and screen. Why the high collar? Since some of you have been on stage, it's a stage prop. When Lugosi had to disappear, he'd turn his back to the audience and lift his collar up, and the collar would be connected to wires, and then he could slink away, and the cape and the high collar would be sitting there, and the good guys would try to grab him, and he'd be disappeared. So this was the high collar that you see in all the costumes was really a stage prop. It was not a Bram Stoker invention. One of the things I needed to do, knowing that I would be crucified by the press, and this is where I need the lights again because I'm going to read something, was I needed some evidence of a few things. One of them is what Bram Stoker thought about his own novel, and then how could I actually bring Dracula back to life. So I'm going to go in reverse order though, because there is an alternate ending to Dracula that helped me, that sort of saved me. So I want someone here to tell me now, how does the story Dracula end? Somebody has read it? How's it end? Stake through the heart. Who puts the stake in Dracula's heart? You. Okay, here's the scene. The band of heroes are chasing Dracula. He's being protected by the gypsies. He's in a coffin. The sun is going down, so when it gets dark, obviously he's going to have his powers back, right? And he's trying to get back into the castle. And yet the band of heroes, Van Helsing and Mina and Seward and Homewood and Quincy, they're chasing after him. They want to get him before he gets his powers back, and they're fighting off the gypsies and rip open the coffin as they get closer and defeat some of the gypsies. And Seward and Homewood literally get right up on top of the carriage, and in the kind of ensuing craziness, it's not a stake through the heart. It's a Bowie knife, thank you. It's the Bowie knife that Quincy has given to Harker, and he thrusts that through Dracula's heart. And yet we learn earlier in the story that the only way to really kill a vampire is the stake through the heart, and cut the head off and put garlic in, or wolfsbane. So why, at the pinnacle point of this story, the alpha of all vampires is not killed properly? He crumbles into dust when this knife is thrust into his heart. Was this Bram Stoker's way of saying, maybe there'll be a sequel? Maybe I'll let my great-grandnephew 112 years later come up with something. Who knows? But I do know there was an alternate ending. And the alternate ending was different than the one we now see. And that when that knife was thrust into the heart, a massive volcano erupted, the earth opened up, the castle, the carriage, everybody, all the bad guys, went down in flames. And if that had stayed in the story, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about a sequel, or a sequel with Dracula, who knows if that would have been interesting. So we know they can shapeshift, we know they can go in a mist. What we decided was he went into dust as a way to escape. And we'll probably see him again. And I'll show you that page in just a moment. What I'm going to read you, though, because I know a bunch you have to go in a moment, so I really want to get this out. This was the one preface that Bram Stoker ever wrote that tells in the first hand what message he's trying to send in his story. And it's only in one book, the Icelandic edition, and luckily I can press translate, and it goes from Icelandic into English, so I can read it to you. And I won't read the whole thing, because it's about a page and a half long, but what I find really interesting is this. I state again that the mysterious tragedy, which is here described, is completely true in all its external respects, though naturally I have reached a different conclusion on certain points than those involved in the story. But the events are incontrovertible. You got the point. And so many people know of them that they cannot be denied. Bram's telling us that this was a true story. And he's not the kind of guy, as you've probably heard from me, that is a BSer. He really believes this is true. And it's based on real events. So what really went on in England in the late 1890s that would give Bram the cause to write this story? The series of crimes has not yet passed from memory, a series of crimes which appear to have originated from the same source, at which the same time created as much repugnancy in people everywhere as the murders of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper murders were going on at the same time in London as Bram Stoker's writing Dracula. And how connected could those be? Here's a society that is counting on the police to protect them, and now they can't, because these murders were horrible. And they were involved, you know, one or two, they never really found out, murderers that were disgorging body, I mean, just horrible things to the bodies. And I'll get to those pictures right now. So it made sense to me. There's that ending, by the way, as you're leaving. This is the crossed out ending. And I will continue once the rest of you guys just stay here and settle in on it. Dracula the Undead. And, you know, reading words of Bram's, and again, there's only two things that exist in history about what and why Bram Stoker wrote about it. So I'm going to just go back, and again, the English is a little bit weird because it's period, but it tells a lot about Bram. So here we go again. This is the Icelandic preface. The reader of the story will very soon understand how the events outlined in these pages have been gradually drawn together to make a logical whole. Apart from excising minor details which I considered unnecessary, I have let the people involved relate their experiences in their own way, but for obvious reasons. I have changed the names of the people and places concerned. In all other respects, I leave the manuscript unaltered, in deference to the wishes of those who have considered it their duty to present it before the eyes of the public. I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place. However unbelievable and incomprehensible that might appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain, to some extent, incomprehensible, although continuing research in psychology and natural sciences may, in years to come, give logical explanations of such strange happenings, which at present neither science nor the secret police can understand. No idea he's referenced the secret police. But that, again, that's interesting. He must know something that we don't know about what was going on those days. I state again that the mysterious tragedy which is here described is completely true in all its external respects, though naturally I have reached a different conclusion on certain points than those involved in the story. But the events are incontrovertible, and so many people know of them they cannot be denied. This series of crimes has not yet passed from memory, a series of crimes which appear to have originated from the same source and which at the same time created as much repugnancy in people everywhere as the murders of Jack the Ripper, which came into the story a little later. Various people's minds will go back to the remarkable group of foreigners who for many seasons together played a dazzling part in the life of the aristocracy here in London. And some will remember one of them disappeared suddenly without apparent reason, leaving no trace. It's got to be Lucy. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Jonathan Harper and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends, and have been so for many years, and I have never doubted they were telling the truth. And the highly respected scientist, this is his brother, who appears here under a pseudonym, will also be too famous all over the educated world for his real name to be used. I have desired not to specify it, to be hidden from people, least of all those who have from experience learned to value and respect his genius and accomplishments. Though they adhere to his views on life no more than I, but in our times it ought to be clear to all serious thinking men that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. That was kind of eerie to me, that this story, based on his mythology and all this historical research, was actually based on some real events with real people in London at the time. And I'm not finished yet digging, because that just sort of whet my appetite to try to figure out, what other people were involved. Who was this person? Was it Lucy that was really gone missing for some reason? That only a few people knew that she became this vampire. And I'm not saying that maybe vampires are the real reason, but something certainly was that caused all these events to happen. Getting back to here for just a moment, look at his original title of the story, The Undead. Yeah, that's all the reading I'm going to do for now. You can get in the last things. The Undead by Bram Stoker. So that was another reason why that became our title. This was his short preamble. I'm sorry you can't read it, but it's in the front of every Dracula book. And it's a short version. It just says the events in the story really took place, but the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Something like that. So here's that crossed out ending I told you about, where the volcano erupts, and this is what's left. And what happens is, in just the ensuing pages, a child is born at the end of the story. And one of the cool mysteries is, well, what would the family have done? When Ian and I were looking at, okay, we want to make our story 25 years later. What would the family have done with a child? Would they have told them of what went on? I mean, it's based on real stuff. They've got a real problem on their hands. And really when we look about the blood transfusions and the blood exchanges, what would have happened to Mina? We know she had at least one interaction with Dracula in the story. I say interaction because who knows really what it was. There was some blood exchange going on. And what would that have left a child to be like when it's born and grows up 25 years later? What about these relationships between his characters? In Dracula, being written in the epistolary style, everything is journals, letters, diaries. There's really no explanation about how these interesting characters got to be friends, this aristocracy Bram talks about. How does a Texan and this guy, Dr. Seward, become friends? How does Mina, who is a middle-class school teacher, become friends with this very upper-crust Lucy, who tends to be this incredible floozy? And then Homewood, who's this very upper-crust guy, how does he hang out with these middle and lower-class folks? In our story, we felt we need to answer some of those questions. That's one reason why we didn't do it in the epistolary style. We also felt we weren't good enough writers to do that, and we needed to modernize the style of the book. But nonetheless, we needed to do this, using those characters in a similar way that Bram did, but they needed to be affected. And those of you, a couple of guys who were in the play, I said, what would it be like when I met the guy who played Jonathan Harker, if you really got into this character? How would you feel at the end of this play, if this was real? These different people were killed, and you guys just did an incredible thing, very risky, to rid London of this blood-sucking creature and chase him back to his castle, but you're not really sure if he's dead or not. So we created something called post-Dracula stress syndrome, which is like guys going to war. Well, we feel these guys really went to war, and what are they going to be like? So that's why we've come up with Seward being very affected, and the marriage between Nina and Jonathan being very affected, and young Quincy, who is going, I want to know what my family did. And why are you guys keeping me in the dark? So when he stumbles into the Lyceum Theater and introduces himself to Bram Stoker to get a job as an apprentice, and they start seeing this, Quincy starts seeing this play going on that involves people named Harper. He goes, hey, wait a sec, I got to find out where this all came from. The writing part that Ian did, not only did he do the merged Dracula, but he did Quincy. And it was so cool and so ironic that Ian is a lot like Quincy. It made it easy for him to write this. Ian is not a very disciplined guy, but he's really creative. And he went to NYU and did all this drama stuff, but probably didn't spend as much time in the classroom as his parents would have liked. But he's also passionate, and he's really into the whole acting and stage and screenwriting, a lot like young Quincy. So that was a natural for him to write that part. I wrote the Bram Stoker part, which was not a very big part of the story, but I also wrote the whole Cotford Jack the Ripper plot. And you heard in the preface that Bram was planning on Jack the Ripper will appear later in the story, and it didn't. So it became a natural for me to connect Cotford, the guy left out of Dracula, with the Ripper, and then create that tragic kind of character. How we did this a little bit was, I organized what I call the playbook, having been a teacher and a coach, where all the characters are supposed to be going, in what sequence, when they're going to have events where they're going to interact. And when one of my characters and Ian's characters did interact, Ian would take a pass at the chapter, I would take the next one. So then our styles became a little more similar when we would take turns writing each other's characters. The critical thing we did that made us look good was that last bullet point right there. Is we brought on board a guy named Alexander Gallant, who is a professional researcher and does research for Canadian television. He's from Toronto. They have these like time travel shows. Alex gets it all right. If you've read our story or you've read Dracula, in Dracula, because Bram's writing in the same time frame, he knows the names of the streets and the different statues and all the right places and the right times. We're writing in 1912, so we had to get Alex to figure Paris, London, Amsterdam, the buildings that existed in those times, the cemeteries, all those things. And he would put us in the frame of mind. We'd say, okay, Alex, we need to get from Marseille to Paris in X number of hours. How can we do it? Well, he found this guy, Henri Salmet, in his airplane, who was a real aviator at the time that was actually in a quest to break the longest flight ever. And so he would get these pictures. This is the Temple Bar Dragon in Temple Bar, an area of London where the barristers hang out, the lawyers. He got me this picture of Whitby. This is the one I said I'll show you later, the 199 steps from the beach where the ship landed all the way up to this cemetery and that abbey. And this is where major scenes happen in our story, as well as Bram's. We also used an editorial service that cost us a lot of money just to get the manuscript to the point where it was good enough that our agent could take it off to publishers to get it sold. This is this town of Whitby, and it really is inspiring to me, but this is where Bram would spend his holidays. I was over there in January to do filming for a Canadian History Channel. They're doing a show on the origin of vampires in pop culture. Of course, they wanted something to do with Stoker, and because of the book, I'm paid to go over here. This town was really cool, folks. And I kid you not, it's eerie. It looks beautiful during the day. Nice, idyllic little fishing village. And it's got, actually, they build fishing ships back in here. But at nighttime, when the fog rolls in, it's like a vampire. It is so weird. It gets misty and dark and wet. These steps are slippery. This old abbey, which is a monastery back in the 1100s, which is in ruins, and I've got them highlighted down here. This is actually when we were filming. They were waiting for the fog to roll in to get some scenes of me, walking along, thinking about Bram and all that. That's what happens. Many takes, let me tell you. But here's this graveyard, and let me tell you something weird about this. The graveyard is right here, right on the cliffs. And guess what happens on cliffs when you have storms and erodible land, which is all sandstone? After every storm, bones and things end up on the shore because they fall out of the cliffs. And it's almost, this is corny, but it's so weird, it's almost like the undead are coming out of the graves. And they literally have the public works people going around every time there's a storm, picking up bones and bringing them back up and sticking them in the ground. It's like, this is too cool. But perfect little town for chapter 6, 7, and 8, if you reread them. Because the actual events, I mean, you literally have Lucy on this side of town going across the bridge. She goes up to this graveyard. This is where Dracula has his way with her. Mina goes over and grabs her, brings her back. It's all right there. This is the actual library where that book was I told you about, that Bram first saw Dracula. The accounts of Principalities, Wallachia, Moldavia. This is what it is today. It's a fish and chip shop with a pretty cool bar up top. Still there, the building is, the book is gone. And then there was Bathory. This is, our researcher found this character. We didn't invent her. We pulled her out of the history books like Bram pulled out Dracula from the history books. And we based her on a real person who really did bathe in blood. She may not have been a blood drinker. We certainly turned her into one, but it wasn't a stretch. And again, it bases a character off of a real person, which gives it, in my opinion, more credibility, make it a little bit more scary. Here's the pictures of real-life Scotland Yard Archives pictures you can get on the internet of a victim of Jack the Ripper called Mary Kelly. Folks, that's the femur bone. That's the big bone of your thigh after the Ripper carved out all the muscle. That's how gross. Look at the face being taken off. That's how I got into the mindset to write the Ripper characters, looking at how brutal this person would be. The other thing I did was the one letter that exists. And I'll read a little bit to you, but I have to get into the brain of this Ripper to see how this person was toying with the police. Read along with me here. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Haha. The next job I do, I shall clip off the lady's ears off and send it to the officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife is nice and sharp. I want to get back to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. This person obviously was a sicko. They all are. And he couldn't be caught. And so this is sort of the toying, the playing that I integrated into my writing of the Ripper stuff. So a good researcher was very, very helpful to us. Ian did his research some years ago. He went over to Transylvania. And one of the coolest points of speculation is, where's the castle? You know, it's like George Washington slept in 18 different places, or 1800. Dracula has many castles where people figured he went to because the Romanian government is smart. They wanted to create a Dracula trail for tourists to come over and spend lots of money at, where in actual fact, the historians have pointed out very few castles that Dracula, the Vlad Tepes, really hung out in and defended. His job, by the way, just to give you the background, interesting story which comes out in our story. The real story of Vlad Tepes was at 15 or 16, him and his brother were given to the Turks as a way to appease them, to stop them from coming across the Danube and invading Europe and taking over Christian Europe. This is the Muslims against the Christians. I mean, things never change. And so, after a period of 4 or 5 years, the brothers were given back. Radu, the other brother, decided to stay. He liked it. So Vlad comes back, fights alongside his father. His father dies. Vlad gets to take over. So how did this Vlad get to be get a bad reputation? He knew the only way he could defend his country was to make sure that all these teeny little armies that were run by the ruling class, everybody had their own little mini army of 1,000 here, 5,000 there. He had to unify everybody because he knew that the Turks, because he was over there, were amassing a force of 300,000 and were going to cross the Danube when they're ready and just come right over Europe. And so the Pope in Rome sent word to these little countries in between Rome and the Danube. This is Hungary, Austria area, and said, "Hey guys, I need some defenders." And so what Vlad did was he invited all the ruling class into his castle at a big party and said, "We got to go to war. Would you guys all die for your country?" Got them all fired up, kind of like a Braveheart scene. They said, "Yeah, we'll die for the country." He said, "Very good." And he got his army to kill and throw into the fire all the leaders of the other armies. So what happened? In a brutal way, he became the leader of all the little armies because he killed off the leaders. And this is how Vlad amassed an army of only 40,000. But this army of 40,000 originated some pretty tough guerrilla warfare tactics. He attacked at night. He threw diseased cattle into their water sources because it's a thing that happens when an invading army comes into your country. You get rid of the food source, you taint the water, you do all kinds of things to make it very difficult for them to fight you. And that's what he did. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. That's when he invented this impaling. Any of the people he captured, he impaled them and put them right here, this forest of the impaled. So the next day, when the Ottomans were starting the next day of battle, guess what would happen? They'd see all their friends, withering away on this long pole. It took a long time to die this way. It was pretty brutal. So eventually, his scorched earth tactics scared off the Ottomans that they just left. And within 3 years, they came back and overthrew. But at least Dracula managed to hold them off for a while. And it was actually Radu who defeated his brother. And Radu cut his brother's head off and brought it back to Constantinople, Istanbul, and said, "Here's the head of this horrible Vlad Tepes, my brother." And his body has never been found. Because at one time, the Romanian government thought it was in Snagoff Island, which is a monastery that Prince Dracula had created so he could have his final resting place in peace in an island. And when the Romanian government dug up the grave to see what's in there, there were wolf bones and a family medallion of the Dracula family, not human bones. So to this day, nobody knows where Vlad Dracula's final resting place is, if there is one. And now the lighter side. That's kind of heavy. The lighter side is when this book comes out, and Ian and I, and in this case Alex as well, hit the trail to promote the thing. Anybody ever heard of Comic Con here? I did. I was there. It was unbelievable. 250,000 people over a week long in San Diego. There's everything there. It is way cool. And we were actually on a panel with a number of writers, horror writers. Here's your quiz. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Steve Niles' 30 Days of Nights. Yeah. Anybody seen it? Pretty cool. Very original. Steve was on the panel. A couple other guys, J. Gordon Melton, who has about 9 books of Dracula. Leslie Klinger, who has got an annotated Dracula, which is way cool. And the topic was Josh Whedon the Bram Stoker of his day? Interesting if you ever want to really have a discussion amongst your friends. Josh Whedon created the Buffy the Vampire Slayer world in a similar way that Bram created his world for his story. So that was an interesting panel, and then we signed books and met all kinds of interesting people. We also, I saw pop culture at its best. This is when True Blood was really making an impact. We had another con called Vampire Con in LA, and there was actually a credit card that Visa paid us just a little bit of money for, but everything helps. to do some promotion. And then this is the tour I go on as an author. When you sell a book, you're required by the different publishers. It was published by 26 different countries. It's not out in all 26 yet. They reserve the right to put it out when they want to. I think it's out in about 15 or 16 now. But I went off to London and did a very similar presentation to what I'm doing now. I went to Ireland, which was very cool. I was a little intimidated, thinking that, oh my gosh, Ireland, I'm telling Irish people, especially Dublin citizens, about Bram Stoker. They're going to know more than I do. But the weird thing is they didn't. One funny story here, what I didn't realize is with all the blabbing I have to do in traveling, it's not difficult to get a sore or an itchy throat. And by this time, it's about day 6 of all the talking. I'm in this guy's radio studio. And you know that feeling when you got a cough that's going, and you're trying to drink water, and he's asking a question, or a caller calls in, and you have to suppress a cough or cover the mic. And I was answering this one question. I was really into it, and I couldn't get the words out quick enough to get to the end of my sentence before I just and it was brutal, overcome me. And this guy, Jerry Ryan, who wouldn't miss a beat, you know, in this great Irish accent, well, I've just killed Mr. Stoker. You know, nobody's been able to do it for many years. Kill Stoker. Bring him something. What's he need? You know, hot blood. I said, no, hot tea will do just fine, Jerry. It's okay. I'll come back. So we took a break, and they brought in hot tea, and I felt fine. And I'm thinking, you know, this guy's just upstaged me in a big way. So when it comes, we're back on again live with Stoker. I said, Jerry, we're not live. We're undead. It's okay. I'm going to be just fine. So he got a kick out of that one. Also in Ireland, this guy, which you'll see in a minute, John Moore has this most unbelievable collection of anything Bram Stoker has ever written, and many copies of it. He has literally about 4 more shelves like this of 1st, 2nd, 3rd edition Draculas and other stories that he has lent me, which I will be bringing to you shortly. In my little town of Aiken, South Carolina, we had a launch at Books A Million, and it was well attended. And my friends had a big party for me the night after, and even Marilyn Monroe showed up to that one. This book is selling better in France than any other country in the world, which blows me away. Obviously something that had to do with the publicity that the publisher put into it. They contracted with Virgin Megastores to have a massive billboard, and the opening was in here, obviously with translators, but we had TVs here with us doing the interviews and then signing books. It was quite impressive, but that's how, you know, you get out of it what you put into it. And I went to Philadelphia, to the home of the Rosenbach Notes, which when I was introduced, I'll never forget, it said, it's the first time since 1962 that we have a living Stoker here. We've had the notes of the dead one, but now we have a live one here, which was fun. And then in Montreal, this is one of my living relatives. We had a hard time figuring out what side of the book to hold up, though. But it was fun to have them present. In Toronto, I got interviewed at a golf bar, which was interesting on the national news. And then one of the cool things that Alex, our researcher, did a stage reading. A stage reading is when you make a script out of a story without putting too many spoilers in, and read in character for the opening in Toronto. They had about 300 people in the audience, and all the characters were obviously dressed. This is Bathory. Here's Lucy and Mina. And they kind of pulled a fast one on me because Ian and I could only fly into Toronto the morning of the reading. So we didn't have a rehearsal. We had just a quick, this is what's going to happen, guys. One is on one side of the stage narrating, and I'm on the other. And they have a scene where this guy, who is Bram Stoker, is spoken to rather violently. And here I am reading my little thing. And what we do is the narrator is saying, and in this scene, it takes place in the Lyceum Theater between Barrymore and Stoker. And then the actors walk out and start saying their lines. And in this case, Barrymore walks out and says, Stoker, do something about this man. And I'm thinking he's talking to me because I didn't see the whole script. And yet, I looked like this, oh my God, what did I do wrong? And of course, this guy appears from behind me as the Stoker character. So they love the effect of pulling a fast one on unsuspecting narrator. We had a reading and a presentation in New York Times Warner Center, which is fun. And then off to Europe. which my wife and daughter came on part of it. The one funny thing here was getting used to having a narrator who will actually translate into a teeny little earbud. So I'm sitting here, and in my right ear, I have almost like a hearing aid, and this lady's talking in Italian. And then I met the translator about 20 minutes before I went on stage. He said, well, I'll be translating everything simultaneous, and then you'll answer. Then I'll translate over the PA system, and then the lady will respond. Well, they didn't tell me there were 60 people in the audience, for one, which didn't bother me, but the whole loop of talking and responding in this paused way was very unsettling. Plus the fact that this girl's voice was so screeching loud, and she was right next to the ear where the little earbud was. I couldn't hear a word the translator was saying. And it was live, so I could say, can we stop and put the thing in the other ear, please? So I had to do the whole interview on speculation as to what I think she was saying, because I could understand French, used to speak it very well, little French and Italian thrown together. So I was really scared that the questions that they were asking me was out of sequence with what the guy had told me about 20 minutes before. So I was really having to just BS it the whole way through the interview. And my only clue was that I was doing any good with it was how the studio audience was responding. Because of course, she would say the question, he would say it to my ear, I would say the answer, he would then respond on the PA. So a couple of people later, I'm thinking, are they going to look at me like I'm an idiot? Are they going to clap? Are they going to laugh if we're supposed to be funny? And luckily, I think I did an okay job until we got through all the questions. And there was a guy sitting in the front row, kind of like you guys are, holds up the dry erasable. This is somebody from the studio, and starts writing questions for her to ask, because I guess the interview's going pretty well, and they want more questions. And now I have no luck, because we didn't rehearse any of these questions. But I understood what they were talking about, because they were asking about George Clooney, who has an Italian girlfriend. And she's saying, and this is what's making her laugh, is, you know, can you get George Clooney and his girlfriend into the movie of the undead? Well, I don't even have any control if ever they're going to make a movie, but that's what they wanted to hear at the time. And so I said, hey, I forget her name now. Oh, but you're so much better looking than George Clooney's girlfriend. You'd be a much better vampirella in the book than George Clooney's girlfriend. And of course, they got a big kick, and I skated away from that. Madrid was great. These two were, you know, anywhere I go, they put me in cemeteries to do interviews. What they also did well was occasionally an author or a very well-read interviewer would give me a really good interview because they read the book, and that was very pleasing. Back to Whitby for a moment, just some more scenes, because that's the filming crew. And then I'm going to end with some book covers of Dracula, just to give you a feel, an ending feel, where my little book, Ian and my book, has been on sale since October, but this one and Dracula has been on sale since 1897. Your ending thought, Pat, this is I was talking to you about Dracula's Guest. If you're into Dracula and you want to read a short story that's part of the mystery, pick up this book. It's very short, but what it talks about is how Renfield may have become Renfield. There's no known reason how Renfield went nuts. We think he was working for the law firm that Jonathan Harker did, and he was the first lawyer that went over to tell Count Dracula what to do with his property, how to sign all the deeds. And yet, these lost few chapters have been turned into a short story by his wife, by Bram's wife. And this is how it's come out years later. So we end with some cool looking pictures. I know a bunch of you got to leave, and I think I probably do too. But the impact of this book around the world is it's pretty cool. And look at these countries, and look at the dates that it came out in, and look at their covers, and try to figure what would make these jump off the bookshelves and people to buy. Look who's here. Lugosi, Israel, 1985. Look at this one. This is the first accurate picture as described by Bram Stoker. It's the only one that really shows Dracula the way Bram described him. Here's Lugosi again in 32. His first movie came out in 31. The Todd Browning version of Dracula was 1931. And And then the lovely little town of Whitby, as I mentioned, just like a vampire, at nighttime, things definitely get a little bit different. And then the final slide, a little bit about us, and then the shameless plug for my good friends at Foxtail Bookstore. They have some coupons up here for you if you like what you hear and you're allowed to read the book. I say this at schools, there is some questionable stuff in it. There's some nice little bookmarks, and I'm not sure, Pat, is it a $4 or $5 coupon? $4 coupon off if you want to buy it. And I was just there before I stopped here. I think I've signed about 15 of them. Our paperback, if you want to hold off, comes out October the 5th. And I will be back there sometime in October to do, we're talking about some kind of big holiday, Halloween festivity. The paperback's obviously a lot cheaper. So I do have time for any little questions, if anybody has some. Yes, sir?
How many copies have you sold so far?
You know, it's funny you say that because I had to research that because the International Thriller Writers Association has nominated us as a best first-time novel. That'll be July, and I had to get to our agent, and he just came up with a rough figure that we've now just broken 500,000 around the world. Any others? I'm gonna get off lightly. Nope. All right. No, that was.
No, she has legs. She went.
Yeah, Tommy, the girl who played, well, she played a Lucy part in the film, in the play here.
Yeah.
Helga, you
Yeah.
remember, she introduced herself to you a while ago.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Parker was just telling me that she's done a lot of reading on Bathory and very, very interested in her. And I don't think she's read your book yet.
How many have heard of Bathory before we did? I mean, yeah, she's definitely been around, and other people have put her in books, no question. Yeah, she's interesting. Yeah. What about Van Helsing? How many other times has he appeared? I mean, there was a whole movie on Van Helsing. Apparently it was a massive flop, big failure for the whatever studio. I don't follow that. Ian does, but I don't. Well, listen, folks, I thank you very much for having me here. It's been a pleasure. I know I've taken a lot of your time, but either that's good or bad. Being a former teacher, I know you like to get out of regular classes. Ooh, here's a question.
What's your favorite character out of the book?
Well, you know, this, besides Bram Stoker, I guess would be the correct one, because it was cool to depict my relative. Nobody else has. So I really liked doing that because I felt a tremendous responsibility to do it right. And if you haven't read it, I didn't over-glamatize him. You've read it, right? And who else has read Dracula Undead? Then you'll know a little bit about it. I wanted to do a realistic picture of Bram. And I did let my relatives know this is how I was depicting him. And they said, that's pretty accurate. He's a pretty no-nonsense guy. Attention to detail, the bottom line, you know, it was a little bit rough, but you heard from his, early on in my presentation, from his obituary, you know, he was a good man, and he was a good man to, you know, have on your side, but he was not sort of just a, you know, kind of a fluffy guy that would just change to meet the situation. He was pretty hard-nosed. So, I would say that would be my favorite character, but that's loaded because he's a relative. Cotford, because I had to invent him, and he's a pretty tragic guy. I mean, I felt that was, if I take Bram, that would be Cotford, even though he wasn't glamorous, but he was probably next favorite. Yes? Okay, those of you that read it, I'm going to ask you to answer that question before I do. Did we leave the door open for any kind of a sequel? What do you think? Don't say too much. The very end of the story. Okay, here's what we dealt with. The very end of Bram's story. You know, it's very ambiguous about who lives and who dies, right? So we had to do a certain amount, but we put Quincy onto a certain vessel that involves transportation that we know what happens with.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
So you know there's a good chance that Quincy is going to survive, but we certainly don't know what's going to happen to the others. But I think it's slightly less ambiguous than what Bram left me. But the other hint that was in the notes, because Bram came to America 8 times with his Lyceum theater troupe, he's been quoted as saying, "I want to bring Dracula to America." So I'll leave that. I'll stop right there. But here's the complicated thing. If you ever get into writing a book, make sure you read your contracts really well. Because our manager, not the agent, manager did a kind of interesting thing. He signed us to a deal with Penguin Canada to give them a sequel this October. Which really is stupid because the paperback comes out in October, and why would you be putting out another book when the sequel still doesn't, when the paperback, which is less than half the price, is supposed to run its course, you're not supposed to have it out for a whole other year. So we basically had to turn back the money and say to Penguin, we're not writing it. We'll do it another year later. So we have a general idea of where we want to go with it. And we'll leave it at that. I wouldn't say definitely. I could only say definitely, and again, I've learned this, that when a contract is signed, you're closer to definitely. When that book arrived, the authors get about 20 free books. When that box arrived in my house, definitely was the word. Up until then, editing, what could go right, what could go wrong. But more than likely, it's just a question of will it be in 2 years or sooner. Yes?
Which was more difficult for you, writing characters that were already invented or maybe not you?
Well, we need to really research the ones that have already been invented because we had to be true to them and not conflict too much. So we had to figure out, what characteristics Bram's guys had, and then apply this post-Dracula stress syndrome and go with it in a logical way. When I was creating my own, it was kind of like an empty canvas that we could play with. And that's what I did with obviously Cotford. But when we had to mess around with Seward and Parker, it was like, well, what pre-existing conditions exist? So they were both difficult, but probably the more difficult was to go with the original guys and make them more modern. It's a good, really good question. What's that? Go the other way?
I think it's easier to write characters that are
Right.
there, but I think that's just
Well, these are characters that have been 112 years old.
yeah.
They've been sold all over the world. I'm scared to death that, it makes them. I mean, we made a couple, you make mistakes where you think you do, and when people call them on, you go, oh, God, I can't believe I got that. We've had people ask us about the daylight issue. We've had people ask us about Carfax Abbey and Whitby Abbey. I don't know if you guys picked up on that. In the original story, Carfax Abbey and Whitby Abbey are 2 different places. They got merged during all of the play productions because of set changes. You could appreciate that. There's so many set changes in Dracula. What do you even do? So they merged them together. So we wanted to, do a little bit of both. We can't please everybody, so we did some of the stuff to please the play guys. How did the Bowie knife, come into play? Was there a Kukuri blade or a Bowie knife? There was all these different questions how we used it. So we had to go back and do a lot of checking to make sure things were the way Bram intended to be. So it may have been a little bit ambiguous in the story. Well, I would say the overly romantic teeny bopper ones, but Dracula in this story gets a chance to be pretty romantic. I mean, I don't know what you guys feel about it, but first of all, we wanted this Dracula to have a voice, and the way a lot of Draculas have been, or vampires have been, they had definite romantic interest. And we felt that this Nina Dracula tension that's been, you know, there for these 25 years but unresolved needed to come out a little bit. So we didn't want to make him too artsy-fartsy, but we wanted to make him tough. He had to be the villain, but at least where his side of the story is told. We didn't want to make him too nice. We had Bathory to be the real bad person, but we didn't want to paint a picture that Dracula was too much like all the present ones. He still had to be bad and gross. But you know, when you think about it, Bram's Dracula was really gross. I mean, he was out of the grave, he smelled, hair in the back of his hands. He wasn't dashing and debonair. So even we had to take some license to sort of bring him forward a little bit to be a little more acceptable to today's vampires. Questions for you?
Was it difficult to write a story that reflects a different time period? Like, how did you figure out?
Yeah. Well, it was. You only saw. I probably got 100 pictures that Alex found of the time frame. We had a map that he got of London, 1912. We got censuses. So we got visuals. I hadn't traveled there. I've been to London. I've been to Paris, but not to research the book, doing sports stuff, so I wasn't focused on that. But it was trying to sit there in my little office with the big screen and the computer going, okay, I'm trying to get this guy to go from here to here and do it, you know, with the blinders on, to sort of look on the computer screen and feel like you were in 1912 with these pictures. I looked at a lot of old movies. I'm a visual kind of guy, so I watched some of the old Dracula movies, even if they weren't from Bram, just to feel like what the buildings were like, the cobwebs and the cemeteries, and that helped me get in the mood to write. But without, I mean, really couldn't have done it without Alexander. So yeah, it was difficult, and that's a, you know, do your research, read the stuff, figure out what's going on at the time. My wife actually helped with the horse carriage harnesses, make sure they were right. And the cars, Alex would say, no, the throttle was on this side. It was a throttle. It was not an accelerator. Different things to do. So we would, you know, if you write the details right, it makes the overall thing usually come into place quite well. You know, the sewer systems that could be used for, you know, sneaking around and hiding from people, the different types of streetlights. Once you get the details right, and you know you got it right, then you could be a little more creative. Anybody else?
What are some of the similarities and differences between the historical Dracula murder and the Dracula recreated?
I can't answer that without spoiling it. It's a good try, but I really can't. I don't think that would be fair. You guys agree? Hold the thought. I'm not going to try to make you buy the book, but you know, I used some real police reports. Again, I got to be careful spoiling, to set certain stages, but then a lot of it is fictionalized. So the parts that were police reports were correct, very small part, to set the tone, and the rest was all just